Just so we start off correctly here, the main goal of this video is not for me to try to sell you something. The main goal for this video is for me to tell you what I did to learn English. So how did I learn English and how did I get fluent in English? So that was my process, and this is the main goal for this video. So this is basically a conversation. It's not just me trying to teach you something or anything. It's just really me saying how I did it. All right. And as you can see, I'm sharing my screen with you here, so we can go through each one of the steps I did. So when I started learning English, of course, I entered a course, and I had a teacher, and this teacher, he had just came from an exchange in Scotland, and he showed me some audios of some guys he was talking to back in the day, and I was so stunned by the way they speak. Like, I was, what? Can I speak English like that? Like, that's awesome. So when I started learning English, I already wanted to speak with an accent. In this case, it was the Scottish accent, right? And because of this, I had some difficulties, right? So after this course, after this teacher, I actually started studying English by myself, and I only went to the classes just because, really. So then what I did was, from day one, from week one, actually, from week one. So from week one, oh, sorry, I already started doing some things, and one of them was watching a TV show in English with English subtitles, right? And the thing here is, of course, I think for the first full season of the show, I didn't understand anything they were talking about. I didn't understand the scenes and whatever else they were saying. I did not understand, but I knew since the beginning that that would help me a lot. I would get used to the pronunciation and etc. Right? And as I told you, I wanted to speak with an accent because I wanted to sound native. My main goal was to sound native, not because I was trying to pretend to be native or something like that, but because I just wanted to have a fluid conversation with anyone I talked to, and we would have no communication problems whatsoever, right? So I wouldn't get to someone and they would be like, "Oh, you're not from here, right? You're from Brazil, or you're, I don't know, I just didn't want to have any communication problems. So what I did was, from day one, I decided to speak with an accent, and at that day, I decided to speak with a Scottish accent, right? And then from day one, I started watching a TV show in English. The name of this TV show is called Downton Abbey. Yeah, that was the closest TV show at that time that I could get that had some of the Scottish accent, right? It had some characters that spoke with a Scottish accent. Of course, now you listen, you can hear me trying to make an American accent here because I am currently doing American accent training with my students. But like 2 months ago, I was speaking with a British accent, right? But since I'm doing this training with my students, I'm doing it with them. So I have to do it with them. So even though I'm recording a video here and trying to help you guys, I'm still practicing the accent together with my students, right? So anyways, so I started to watch Downton Abbey, and I had a copy of a DVD for a movie called, I think it's Train Spotter. I think that's the name. It's a terrible movie, but it helped me a lot with the Scottish accent back then because we didn't have many materials on Scottish accent. Back in the day on YouTube, you couldn't find many things about the Scottish accent itself. So every single thing I learned about the Scottish accent, I learned by trying to find patterns, right? So I had to do it like by myself. I had to really concentrate on the speech and try to find patterns on the speech so I could apply myself and then try to sound more Scottish when I spoke. So that was the thing. And of course, this is what I do, for example, for every accent that I learn and for every accent that I train my students. to do, right? So for example, for the American accent, we started with 3 of the main patterns with the R sound, and now we go into the vowel sounds. But anyways, and then at that time we didn't have many things with the Scottish accent, so I had a copy of this DVD, the Transporter, and what I also did, of course, fully in English, there was no subtitles whatsoever. And what I did besides that was I downloaded. Of course, nowadays I don't think you really need that, but I downloaded an app. I don't remember the app, but it was a radio app. Yeah, it was a radio app that had the Scottish radio, so I could listen to Scottish radio without being in Scotland, right? So that way I could listen to native people talking, and I could try to, find those patterns again and then repeat with some practice and try to get better at the speech. So the thing here that I'm trying to show is since day one, I was not only focusing on the phrases and how to build the phrases, but also I was also focused on pronunciation, on how I would pronounce things, right? Because even if I spoke a very basic English with very basic vocabulary, not many words, people could understand me regardless of how much vocabulary I had, because they could understand whatever I said, because I said it with a perfect accent. Not perfect, but a very good accent, right? And of course, then what I did was every time I learned a new word and I learned a new phrase, I would practice. I would write a full notebook with all the pages. I would write on dialogues and phrases and questions in English, and basically I would create dialogues, conversations, and phrases and questions in English with what I was learning, right, in English since day one. So I think in the first week I was already with like half of a notebook filled with phrases and dialogues and conversations. And you may ask, well, how come if you don't know many words? Because I noticed a pattern, right? So when you start to learn English, there are 2 ways of creating questions, right? So it's very easy, but like the first way is with the to be, so the verb to be. So if you have the verb to be in the phrase, if you build an affirmation in English and you want to transform that into a question, if it has the verb to be, you can just make the inversion with the pronoun, and then you have the question, right? And the second way of creating questions is when you have the auxiliary verb. So when you have the auxiliary verb, you put the auxiliary verb in the beginning of the phrase, right? And you don't make any kind of inversion unless it's an auxiliary of the future, for example, will, right? But besides that, with these 2 ways of creating questions, I could make many questions. For example, I could start with he wants to go with you, and then I would transform this into a question. I would ask myself, of course, this is the affirmation, yeah, and I want to change to transform this affirmation to a question. So what I do is I ask myself, well, does this phrase is there any verb to be in this phrase? In this case, there's none, right? So he wants to go with you, there's no to be here. So if there's no to be, I add the auxiliary. In this case, the auxiliary for he is does. And when we put the auxiliary here, the auxiliary, auxiliates. So the thing is, the verb goes back to normal. So you repeat he, right? And then the verb that was modified in the affirmation, it goes back to normal. So does he want? And you repeat the question, to go with you, right? The same happens with the to be, but then you don't need the auxiliary, right? For example, he is walking by the mall, I don't know. And then I want to transform this affirmation to a question. What I do is I ask myself again, is there any to be verb here? And there is, right? So the verb to be here is. So what I do is I make the inversion with the pronoun. So it is like he walking by the mall. Sorry. The mall. Sorry. Yeah. So then these are the two ways of creating questions. If you take any sort of question in English, it follows one of these two ways, right? So it either make the inversion or you add an auxiliary back in the beginning of the question, right? So then, since I noticed this pattern, I was like, well, then I can pretty much create any question that I want, because then I can get, I don't know, I can start from Portuguese and then go down. So for example, and then the first step here, coming from Portuguese, is like I transform this into an affirmation in English. So it's like, he is going home now. This is the affirmation in English coming back from that Portuguese question. And then what I do is to transform this affirmation into a question. I do the same. I ask myself, is there the verb to be is present here? And there is. So I do the inversion. So is he going home now? Right? So then after I noticed this pattern, I was like, well, then I can create pretty much any question I want. So that's how I could fill like half a notebook in less than 1 week of dialogues and questions in English very easily, because I noticed this pattern, right? And I knew that, well, since I know most of the questions I can think of, I can now create them. Of course, if I don't have the word, specific word, so for example, let's suppose this word in Portuguese I didn't know, I would just look for this word in a specific and then come back and finish the phrase, right? And then as for me to to forget this word, I would create some other phrases with the same word. Yeah, for example, and then I would transform this Portuguese question into an affirmation in English. So like, he does not like to stay home, right? And then again, it doesn't have any verb to be. So, and of course, since we already have the auxiliary there, we just make the inversion back. So does he not like to stay home? Right? So it comes back to what I said. So there are two ways of creating questions. Either you make the inversion, just like the verb to be, right? Or if it doesn't have any verb to be or any auxiliary already, you put the auxiliary back in the beginning of the question. In this case, we already had the auxiliary, so we just make the inversion. So as you can see, it's very simple. Like I could pretty much create any question I wanted. So then I thought, well, if I can create any question I want, and I tried to go into a conversation, right? So now the next step I did was I got into conversations. And how I did that was through Discord. Yeah, there's a server on Discord called English. And now I have my server for my students also, but there is this English server on Discord, which has people from all over the world that you can talk to. And it's pretty good to practice. I used that, and when I entered this server, what I noticed is this was like at the second week, right? So what I noticed was, even though I could create any question I wanted on paper, when I was trying to speak, I was not so fast, right? So I was delaying too much to create the phrases, to create the questions, to create, to build phrases to talk really. So I was struggling a little bit because I was delaying too much. Because on the paper, you can take your time, but when you're speaking, when you're talking to someone, it's a little harder. So then I thought, well, why am I delaying, right? I asked myself that. So why am I delaying? And what I want you to notice here is the methodology I created for myself was like, I'm going to go for each mistake that I feel that I have, and I will focus on this mistake and correct this mistake. So for most of people, they will go here and they will, notice that they are struggling to talk, and they will just say like, oh, all right, so I'll just continue talking, continue practicing, and then I'll get better. But that doesn't really work. So what I thought was, why am I delaying to create these phrases? And then I noticed that it's just like when you play, right? So I do play the guitar, and what happens is, even though I know I sung and I can think of the notes, if I don't practice slowly on the guitar first, even though I know the notes, that's the case of this one. So even though I know how to create how the words are and etc., I was delaying to create the phrase. I was delaying too much to talk. So it was the same with the guitar. So I don't know if I get any kind of song, and even though I listen to the song very much, but I don't practice enough. If I practice 1 or 2 times and I try to play, I will stutter. I will play wrong notes. I will just not be able to play in the velocity and the speed of the song, right? And then what I do with the guitar is I notice that, and I go back to practicing, and I practice slowly, and I go speeding up, and then after some time, after I create the muscle memory, I can play pretty well in the speed of the song. So then I thought, well, I would try to do the same with English, and that worked, because what I did was, I just showed you that I started creating dialogues, conversation, and phrases and questions in English because I knew I could make all of them, right? And then I started doing more and more and more and more. So the structure of the phrases and of the questions was so easily fit into my brain and so easily stored in my brain because I did so many of them, that afterwards, after 3 to 4 weeks, when I got into Discord again to try to talk to people, I wasn't delaying that much again, right? It was faster. So I noticed that I was evolving because of that. So I started doing even more. And then after like 2 months, 3 months, I was already speaking much better. But what I want you to notice is, of course, for you to create more dialogues and more phrases and more questions, you want words, right? So, of course, I would find, I don't know, some phrases, some question I would like to create, but then I don't know 1 or 2 words. And then I have to know these words, yeah? And one of the things I told you was like, I just search for this word and go back. And for me to not forget this word, I do more dialogues and more questions with that word so I don't forget it. Right. But then what else I did was like, I watch it more every day. I would watch like 10 to 15 minutes and write down words that were repeating and I didn't know. So every word I was repeating twice or 3 times and I didn't know that word, I was writing down the word. Yeah? Because if it is repeating, it will probably continue repeating. And then if I already know it, when it repeats again, I will know what it means, right? And I will store that in my brain. That is one part of it. And then, yes, I did that. And the second part was, after I wrote those words, I would stop watching. After I got like 3 to 5 words, I would stop watching and I'll come back to my notebook, and then I would fill like half a notebook again, creating dialogues and questions and phrases, but trying to use those words I wrote down whilst I was watching, right? And by doing this, I would never forget, or actually the probability of me forgetting those words was very little, because not only I wrote down those words and I saw them, but I also created many phrases and dialogues and conversations with those words. So I was not forgetting words. That was not a problem that was happening to me because I was doing this, right? So this helped me much as in remembering the words, right? I would not forget many words in English. And then after this, of course, you have watching and then creating these dialogues and conversations, but then I would test myself going into conversations with people, right? This is not natives, by the way, right? These are people from all over the world that are practicing English too. So I got into conversations with them. We would talk about any sort of random thing, and I was practicing. Yeah. And every week I got that, and I was doing the first thing and the second thing here which is dialogues and watching, dialogues and watching, dialogues and watching. Like 3, 4, 5 notebooks later, when I got getting into conversations, I was noticing every single time, every single week, I was evolving too much. I was stunned because I was like talking to people and I would notice, wow, now I can pretty easily talk without delaying, you know. I was speaking in a very good pace, I can say that, right? And so then it was very easy because in one month, 2 months maybe, I was already feeling like, well, I can talk to anyone I want with no problems, and now I can focus a little more on my pronunciation. And then what I did was I got into the British pronunciation, and then I got into accent experts, right? And now that I can create pretty much any question and dialogue I want in English, and I can have a basic conversation with no stutter, with no problems whatsoever, then what I want now is to have no problems on people understanding me, right? So now I know how to express myself very well. And since I was worried about pronunciation since day one, so my pronunciation wasn't that bad, but sometimes people would misunderstand me because I would, for example, say feet I would say feet instead of fit here, right? Which it's just the same as saying feet, so it's not correct. The first one is fit and the second one is feet. The same here, I would say tip instead of tip, right? So people would misunderstand me because of some of these things. This is just one simple example. And then I found accent experts online, and then I started having lessons with them. And then I noticed that every single English accent and English speaking country has an accent and pronunciations inside those accents and etc. And then I started noticing the patterns, right? And that's how I learned the British accent, how I mastered the British accent back then. And this is the same what I'm doing now with the American accent, with the training I'm doing with my students as to practice the American accent, right? So basically, that's basically it. I didn't do more than that. I didn't use Duolingo. Like, of course, I use a Duolingo, but I was not a, how can I say that? Like, I was not the guy that goes every day into Duolingo. I was like 1 or 2 times when I didn't have time to create dialogues or questions, I would enter Duolingo and solve some questions there, some exercises. But most of my time I would dedicate to this part here: dialogues, conversations, phrases, and questions in my notebook, right? I would write them on my notebook. I would fill 2, 3, 4 notebooks with phrases and conversations and questions because this was so easy. Because since the day 1, I noticed that there are 2 ways of creating questions, which unlocked my phrase creation and my dialogue creation too, right? So this was the key for me. So if you really start noticing this pattern, you can easily come to this part, which is the most important. So if you do more of this, it's, you know, the probability of like 2 months from now, if you start doing this 2 months from now, the probability of you having still struggling on creating phrases and questions is 0, right? And if you do more and more and more, like 15 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day, 40 minutes a day, I don't know how much time do you spend on learning English, but the more you do this, in this, of course, to get the words, in this to practice, the easier it's going to be for you to create phrases and questions, and the faster you're going to speak, so it will not delay too much as to try to talk to people, right? So basically, this is what I did. I think I could express myself in a very, how can I say that, understandable way, maybe. And I think I might have helped you here. And if you want to get into my courses, you have to be Brazilian, right? And if you are Brazilian watching this video, there is my English course, my intro English course, which is called Method Accent, right? And if you are already intermediate to advanced, what I mean by intermediate or advanced is that you can easily have a basic conversation in English without delaying to speak and etc. And you want to improve your pronunciation, you can go to my American expert. This is the American training, right? And that's basically it. I hope I have helped you here.